Good. Okay, I finally call this house order. Welcome everyone to the quarterfinals of National Novice 2014. Woo! Competition we have SAS Suwekt, and our opposition we have DJ Alpha. Congratulations to both teams for making it thus far. Without further ado, may I invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate and stand to the motion and stand to his name.
First. Bo. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me make side guide. As you all know, most countries have actually made more strict law towards this environment when Egypt has actually snowed. But for certain reasons, some of these companies or anyone, the scientists, had actually made a claim where Egypt has actually snowed before and it's just a normal climate change, which we believe has caused the complacency of the society, which they don't think it's actually their fault that this climate had already changed. But we believe that this climate change is what the society sees. Therefore, when you tell them that this climate change is caused entirely by non-human factors, we believe that they will actually think that they are not at fault. Which we believe if we were to implement this motion in which we disallow any content that claims, we believe that society will actually see this as part of their fault, and they seeing that this climate change is a bad problem, they see it by their eyes, they will eventually change at the end of the day. But what is our case today? Our case here is simple. We will restrict any information from anyone who has it, meaning regardless whether it is the truth, whether it is a fact, or whether it is not, which we believe that side opposition has to debate on the grounds not to call it a bluff, but to actually tell us why should we give transparency towards them. But even if they were to say about transparency, we believe that it is in the social contract theory which the government can actually take the rights of these certain individuals for the betterment of the society, for the utilitarian benefit at the end of the day. But what is our stance? We are not trying to prove who to blame, but we are actually be better and will not be polluted in today's debate. But why particularly climate change? Firstly, because we think that is what the humans see, and that is what, when you tell them that it is their fault that the climate had actually changed, when Malaysia is actually hot because their fault, they will eventually repent and actually change just to actually be for them at the end of the day. And the society is actually not aware towards other type of pollution in which we believe that this is why particularly we are saying that it is towards this climate change. And they merely care about this normal type of pollution where they actually throw rubbish into the river and things like that, which we believe that this is also part of the pollution that we want to mitigate, because they will eventually be environmental friendly when we tell them that this cause is actually their fault. But side opposition will tell them that this is non-human factors, which we believe they will be negligent at the end of the day. But we believe that it is particularly when people see this climate change, they see their fault. They are part of contribution into the destruction of the environment. They know, and now that they are aware, they are going to change, which we believe is good in today's debate. But what do we have in today's debate? But before I move on, yes. Okay, let me tell you about the marketplace of ideas. We believe that ideas can be generated, but in this case, when you tell the society these type of ideas, they will eventually use this type of claim to actually go against the environment. But I will elaborate more on that later on. But firstly, what are the harms of the content being revealed? We believe that society will now, what are the harms of the content being revealed? We believe that society will now perceive that their fault is not a contributing factor of climate change, meaning to say that they won't care at the end of the day, because when they think that it is not their fault, they will eventually be okay with the deforestation, because at the end of the day they see that there's no harms towards it, and climate change is just a normal occurrence, which we believe it is not, because clearly in the fourth stage of see that when people actually pick which trees to plant, it is actually their fault that actually the climate change had caused worse problems in today's debate. But also, we believe that complacency of society based on that ideology will occur, because the human mindset itself, when they know that it's not their fault, they won't care. But when we tell them that it is their fault and they will actually be affected by this form of things, it will be enforced and it will be better towards them. No, I'll not accept anymore. But also on how we believe that our policy reduces the pollution globally. Because of why? Now that we believe that the pollution rate has, meaning to say that people are actually neglecting the fact that they are the contributing factor in this. They are the contributing factor inside this pollution. When you yourself tell them that the climate change is caused entirely by non-human factor, you are actually telling them that it is not their fault, and the government could not also use any form of revelation towards this type of. People neglect the environment for their own interest, which I will also tell you on how that now that you allow any content of the claim of climate change is caused entirely by non-human factors. We believe that corporation can also use this type of claim for them to actually go against the environment. What do we define by this corporation? They are actually capitalists in which they go for their own interest. They don't care about the government because they just want money at the end of the day. Therefore, they will use this claim to actually do more deforestation, fracking or things like that, because at the end of the day, when society tell them say that this does not affect the climate change at all, and this is not their fault at the end of the day. But what will happen when you allow this type of content to actually being revealed? We believe that it is also a form of you letting the form of claim that actually will be destructive towards this environment. We believe that when they use this as a reason and defend themselves, this should not happen, because this type of claim, we can see that it is untrue, but maybe some scientists have justified for certain reasons, but they will actually particularly use this type of reason to defend themselves in court, which we believe that it is not a legitimate reason at the end of the day. But what do we have towards you today? We tell them that we disallow any content that claims this climate change is caused entirely by non-human factors, because we believe at the end of the day they will be complacent and they don't even care about the government today. But we do not want this type of claim will be this type of corporation can actually use this type of claim to defend themselves, because at the end of the day we all know that humans contribute towards this type of environment, towards this type of climate change, and they themselves actually contribute to the loss of environments. And with that, such government stands in today's debate. Thank you.
There are many theories that exist within society. There is a theory on creationism, whether we were all created by God through Adam and Eve, or whether we were all created through the Big Bang Theory and how the world was created. These are theories that exist within the marketplace of ideas, because we recognize that there needs to be an idea of discourse and counter-discourse towards each and every person's beliefs. We recognize as a state that everyone needs to be able to use those theories and evidences to make their rational choice, and that's ultimately what government is preventing. Another example, there is theory on abortion, right? Whether the ball of cells inside a woman is actually just a ball of cells and not yet alive, or whether it's a fetus that is already alive and abortion is ultimately killing someone. That is a theory that we always allow for women to make their best choice and rational choice in which they want to make those choices. And ultimately, side government is not allowing for people to have the freedom of expression, but not allowing people to make any choices on their own because they are blatantly only giving them a certain theory that they have to adhere to. Before moving on to my two arguments, let's look at few rebuttals. Because side government's main idea was debating on the idea and assumption that people will suddenly be aware and suddenly have so much love for the environment. We think that number one, this is extremely subjective and is dependent on the person himself. But even if that happens, we think that there are already check and balances and things that exist within society. We think we have Kyoto Protocol that almost every country in the world already adheres to. Only 4 countries don't want to adhere to it. But you also have things like the Copenhagen Accord, which a lot of countries also adhere to in order to make sure they're nationally present and they make sure that corporations in their own countries adhere to certain environmental laws that don't commit to these things. So this is an entire huge thing that everyone will be so irrational as to not believe in these theories, because we already proved to you how states already adhere to all different types of theories and make decisions based on that. But we think that how you solve your problem then is to increase regulation on your side. Sure, we can solve that based on your regulations purely. But the next idea on how society thinks is by non-human factors. Number one, again, when people always have obvious evidences and facts by different kinds of scientists. So if there is a certain theory, there's always evidence. But if there's another theory, you also have evidence. This is why we allow for counter discourse and counter discourse, right? But even if people really want to believe it and only use it as a defense, we think that at least then they can make a rational choice. Because the idea and the benchmarks towards rational choices is if you have a plethora of choices which you never allow. But what if other theories are also not true and also a blatant lie? Under your situation, you are promoting double standards in that situation, whereby you only allow a blatant lie to exist. But lastly, we think that discourse and counter discourse can only exist on our paradigm, and that's particularly good because you allow for people to make their best choices and you allow for people to disprove theories that they don't believe exist. So if your theory on how it's only based on non-human factors is such a stupid theory to begin with, we think that it will be disproven already and people that harmful. But the last idea on the social contract and how states always have to protect people and how they surrender certain rights as people on the ground. We think that only works when there's an objective harm that exists. And in this situation, because none of the theories are actually proven to be the ultimate theory, you will never prove an objective harm towards these people. Because you think without things like banning suicide or banning murder in this situation, there is an objective harm towards it. States can never make decisions based on non-objective harm. That's why they never ban abortion in most cases, because abortion is not proven to be an objective harm, and there are many theories against it. My two arguments for you today. Number one, right to freedom of expression and research. Because we think on the first level, every person, research and scientist has the ability to exercise their freedom in researching whatever they want and in getting any forms of evidences and facts. So even though they might harm, so we don't think they might harm anybody in this situation, because the freedom can only be removed when there's an objective harm, ultimately. And considering that there's no certain theory that is proved to be right, we don't think you can prove an objective harm in this situation. But also, this is how discourse works, because rhetorics and counter-rhetorics have to exist within a public way of discourse, right? Why is this so? My second level, because it allows individuals to make rational choices and rationalize themselves. Again, the idea of abortion, because when you read we think that people have to make choices based on informed choices. Under your side, you don't give them any form of informed choice to make the choice was what's best for themselves, and they believe in themselves because ultimately they have no. But even if in the we tell you that it's already a self-correcting mechanism in which people can disprove it or prove it within the status quo. But we think it's even more harmful, right? On the fourth level, when you oh, sorry, that's my second argument, right? My second argument on how it allows excessive exaggeration that this theory will necessarily be the truth and it will affect radical policies. Because we think that when people on the ground need to rationalize certain things, and governments also need to rationalize what are their priorities in the situation. We think that governments should have the ability to delineate in which should be their priorities and which shouldn't. So if economic policy needs to be prioritized in certain situations, we think you already have laws like certain corporations can only cut down as many trees or that many acres of trees. And this is responding to his already there's already major rhetorics against the BP oil that happened right when they have a BP oil spillover. They were fined massively. They were boycotted by many people. These are exist in which corporations cannot do all those harms. But what happens when you allow for the excessive exaggeration when no other theory is there to go against it is you allow for radical policies to be come up by environmentalists. How does this harm the state and harm the people around them if they have no ability to disprove those ideas or do anything otherwise that could be a rational choice to themselves? What is this harmful to the state? Because they have a force to make certain make certain choices and economic changes because they believe there's an environmental deficit that's harmful to them. Especially for developing countries in which they cannot make certain choices that's best for the economy. And the state has no ability to opt out or ever develop themselves because they always believe in the exaggeration by these environmentalists. But moreover, we think that policies that already exist are good enough. But thirdly, when there's never any counter discourse, you are allowing for people to believe in another blatant lie that is never disproven in that situation. But also, how is this even more harmful, right? Because when you ban research towards a certain theory, especially in this situation, it's a non-human factor, you ban all research towards it and nobody will ever want to research against that because no one will ever believe it to begin with. That's harmful because people around them that could make certain changes in how they treat the environment will ultimately not know if that thing that they're doing to save the environment in that situation could actually be harming and aggravating those other non-human factors. So, example, if you don't actually understand how the world works, theories on how the earth will shake in an earthquake or whatever, that's harmful because people that want to make positive changes will never understand how the world really works, and they could be possibly doing aggravating factors towards that could ultimately harm the environment even more. Under our side, we give you rational choice, we give you proper discourse, and we are already saving the environment through our policies.
It is true that climate change isn't something that we can prove it is humans' fault or not. Then therefore, if people want to choose to believe in which either one, we do think it's true. But then, we don't think in this context it is possible. Because we're talking about environmental destruction, which is happening because of the complacency of humans to even care about the environment. And we've already done those kind of awareness that people are creating pollution inside the world. Yet we can still see people being complacent, even with the Kyoto Protocol or even with the Copenhagen Treaty. That's why we can still see oil platforms are still being built. Therefore, we can still see companies being complacent in taking care of the checkers and the security of their own oil platforms in the first place. We need to increase the awareness of this situation. But the only possible way for us to do so is by saying that climate change is the fault of humans. Because the magnitude of awareness that we actually try to create by actually putting this blame onto humans is detrimental and effectively huge. Therefore, we think she tried to come up to this stage and say that people do have a right to freedom of choosing which one is true and to actually have research. But we cannot actually open up this complacency because it affects the world as a whole. If you allow people to actually choose the option that this environmental problems the climate change is not caused by humans at all, then therefore they will be complacent in actually trying to be much more environmental friendly. Then therefore we think because it affects the whole world globally on if you actually try to let people to environmentally pollute everything, then we think that it is no longer a right because we want to prove it can actually affect everyone. Then therefore, right to freedom of research shouldn't be taken into consideration in today's debate. But sit down there, bro. Even if you want to talk about this check and balances happen, right? Well, that's the whole situation. Humans have a problem when they only realize those problems when they already even happened in the first place. With actually by Therefore, they actually try to become responsible after seeing this kind of situations. Do you think that is harmful? Because this destruction is very irreversible. Like how the destruction made that has led to the air pollution that we can see in today's era, right? But when we actually say it's because of those situations, people wouldn't even actually relate. Actually say that it is also the cause of climate change, and therefore people will be much more aware about their own faults and will become much more environmentally responsible. Now, before moving into my contentions, any one of you?
So you can't prove that any one theory is the main thing that affects the whole world, right? Some opposition also wants to save the environment, but we're trying to look at all the different factors that affect it, not just saying it's only our
We
fault.
think that side opposition here is being very dismissive with my Prime Minister over here, in which you already explained that if you allow people to choose the option that they believe in the idea that it's not the fault of human for climate change, it will create complacency, and therefore it will lead to more environmental destruction, something that we want to prevent in today's debate. Therefore, it is not right for them to even choose whether one is true or not. Side government here is not trying to debate on that it is humans' fault that this climate change even exists. We are trying to prove to you the merits of that we can achieve if we actually put the blame onto human actions. So now moving on with my contention, moving on with my substantives, in which we aim to enforce the state to create much more environmental policy. We think that this kind of problems that actually exist in today's status quo through government policies, such as like industries that produces carbon emission, which are huge, and also huge river pollutions that can only be solved by government's policy, by putting mitigations and also putting this kind of policies onto these companies, right? And therefore, we think that it is necessary for us to actually use the power of the state and actually use this kind of power to actually enforce these kind of policies onto these corporations or even into these problems that are too big to be solved by only humans. But right now, we face a problem where people try to choose that climate change is not their fault. And then therefore, because when we try to aware that pollution is also their fault, they don't see this as a problem in the first place. Because when you actually tell them pollution is their fault, it doesn't create much more effect than when you actually tell that climate change is their fault. Because climate change is such a huge effect towards people because they think it affects globally and people will trust it more because people become much more responsible, right? But if you're talking about a certain pollution, people wouldn't care about that much. And therefore, what it actually tells you, it creates pressure inside people to even force the state to actually impose these kind of policies onto these corporations or even onto these kind of problems that are too huge for people to even solve the problem, right? Then therefore, we think because the state doesn't want to lose its credibility as a responsible state who also wants to protect the security of the people by solving the problems that exist in environment, because these problems in environment are actually linked towards the climate change, and therefore government will also bear the burden of really guilt over this kind of situations where they also think that they also contribute to the problem of climate change as well. Before we move on, yes.
Considering that destruction of the environment is not legitimized and completely stated it's because of human factors, who gives you the right to remove the right of people to make rational decisions?
Because we have a problem here in which environmental destruction here is so detrimental in today's status quo. And because we've already aware people that pollution is already their fault, yet they are not listening, we need to give a much more bigger reason to feel much more guilty and become much more responsible of taking care of the environment. That is the whole debate. Yes, we cannot prove that whether or not we cannot prove that climate change is the fault of human beings. But what we much more responsible, including the state, to even care about the environment if we relate this problem of humans towards climate change and let them bear their guilt in the first place, right? So through this, we can force the state to actually create much more environmental policies. Now, state will actually pose more quotas onto environmental companies. Government will give more efforts in river cleaning as well. And therefore, we think that problems such as like illegalizing on slash and burns could also be solved in today's debate when they see there's a much more huger problem that they're causing, right? And then therefore, we think that we can solve this problem of huge pollution and actually relating the fault of creating climate change towards the actions of the people and also towards the actions of the state. Government here thinks that it's a huge benefit for us to even hide this kind of information that would possibly be true, but because it could lead to complacency, but because it's also going to lead to a huge benefit, therefore we think it is justified for us to help to hide this kind of info. But we don't think it's manipulative. It is still the truth. Environmental is going to be destroyed, but right now, should we blame it? Should we blame humans for the fault of climate change as well? We say yes, for the benefits of it.
side government believes that this issue was subjective, but at the same breath, they said that it's humans' fault. So we think that all their points were contingent upon the idea that they had to prove that the theory that climate change was merely and solely humans' fault, then their points will be able to run. Because all their benefits, they say that the state would change the policies and state will make individuals more environmentally conscious, would be contingent upon the idea that it's all humans' fault to begin with, and therefore the corrective mechanism is to change human awareness. But they agree that you're subjective to begin with and could not legitimize that theory. So we don't see how their benefits at the end of the day would lead to a positive change if that theory was false at the end of the day. A few rebuttals before I move on to my speech. They said they could change the perception of people, and we think we change perception best. Because banning it only proves that the theory that climate change is up to other theories, such as it's caused by non-human factors. It proves that this idea was weak to begin with, and banning it is the only way to make this idea legitimate. That's harmful, because it says that rational that if we don't ban it, we think that that's an important theory that individuals should be allowed to believe in. If the issue is subjective, it's always, the authority is always transferred to individuals, right? You are able to rationalize whether abortion, pro-choice or pro-life, it's a legal stance for you to take. Don't think that it's allowed for the state to ban it in public court of a marketplace if you agree that's subjective to begin with. Furthermore, they said it's no longer a right if people pollute. But that's contingent on you proving that polluting actually affects the environment. If you agree that it's subjective, without a doubt that it's subjective, then how is it really an issue? Because they concede today's debate that it could be also by non-human factors. It could be also by other theories that exist. But their side harms the environment because they only intend to focus upon that one theory. We think that other theories need to be solved as well. We think other theories need to be paid attention to as well. We don't think that side is the best side which caters towards all forms of solving environmental problems. No, we think they said furthermore that check and balances in current status quo is not enough because people still pollute the environment. If the current check and balances in the status quo, which have legal repercussions, are not enough, how does your side merely banning a theory is ever enough to change the mindset of people? We think legal repercussions were able to fine people, put people in prison. We think that cap the state's trade quotas. We think those things are extremely harmful, and the legal repercussions already exist. We think if your side banning it doesn't make any marginal benefit or marginal change to begin with. But banning it is different, right? Because banning something doesn't mean that people will believe in the converse theory. So banning the idea that climate change is caused by non-human factors doesn't mean that you create the idea that people should believe that's caused by humans' fault. We don't think they actually prove that theory. We think that actually harms the idea that it creates awareness at the end of the day. But Eliza told you a specific point, which was so how is a that if one theory is false that you should ban it, then there should only be one theory existing in the marketplace. But they all allow a variety of theories to exist in the marketplace, and that's a double standard to begin with. But secondly, Eliza also told you how it promotes radical environmentalist theories, where radical environmentalists allow current status quo under their side to change the mindset of state to always prioritize environmental development instead of economic development. I think those are situations that are especially harmful to developing countries because they believe it's a double standard where the Western countries are already allowed to be developed until that point that now they have to be stagnant, now they cannot develop any longer. Before I move on to my points, any POIs?
Yes, climate change is very subjective, but that pollution is not. Right now, we've already put the blame onto the people about pollution, yet we need another PhD effort to actually give them a reason.
POI contradictory to begin with. They say it's subjective, yet they say it's humans' fault. Which is it? We want you to make up your stance so we're able to rebut you clearly. We think even if it's humans' fault at the end of the day, we think that it harms the ability for the state to create that form of truth that it's actually humans' fault. And I'm going to how it destroys the pursuit of truth about what the actual cause is. Because look, if the issue is subjective, truth can best be found with the most amount of information. Truth is determined in the court of marketplace of ideas. If you don't censor it, people will take down these irrational ideas rationally by defeating it to begin with. When there's a discourse about it, ideas can legitimately be disproved. So they said that a lot of people attach the ideas that they should pollute the environment with these theories. We think that's especially good because we can target these specific individuals and say, your theory is false for a variety of reasons. Under your side, just because you ban a certain ideology doesn't mean people still don't believe in it, doesn't mean people believe in the converse theory. We think that's harmful for you creating that form of awareness. But what furthermore, we think that universities have a lot of freedom to publish research even though it's controversial in status quo today because they have authorities on scientific matters. We think that's already a self-regulatory mechanism in the marketplace of ideas, where if you're not a scientist or if you're not anyone of a legal standing, people just don't believe your ideas anyway. So I think it's important under our side that these scientists are allowed to publish these controversial opinions, which could beneficially increase the idea, increase awareness of what the actual cause of climate change actually is, because it filters out public discourse by stupid people, discourse by bigoted people, right? We think it promotes further research. What happens under your side is that less money is put into research to prove that this theory is wrong, because it's already banned anyway, but less money is put into the research to disprove to prove the theory is right to begin with. Because if the theory is already objectively right, there's no reason to prove it even further through scientific evidence, through factual evidence under those circumstances. And that's especially harmful in the pursuit of truth, of what actually causes climate change. We think it's especially harmful when scientists only focuses research on one theory or can't really focus research on anything else. What's the harm is this? If that theory turns out to be false at the end of the day, they cannot publish proof to prove that this theory is illegitimate. They can't convince people in society that this theory is subject the environment and the pollution of the environment, and how we can actually change, because they are not able to tackle the actual cause at the end of the day if this theory is disproven. And that's the major harm under their side. They could never reprove that this theory is objectively right or objectively wrong, and at the same breath they say that it's subjective but it's humans' fault. We don't know at the end of the day whose fault it really is, and in order to find out whose fault it really is, we have to allow scientists, we have to allow academies to really put research and put more money into research and development and into this kind of thing to really find out the actual cause. Under their side, the harm is that it's irreversible. If you can never find out the actual cause, we don't think you should ban it. We think you should promote more discourse on the ideas, more discourse to legitimately disprove the ideas in the marketplace. That's when people and individuals can truly be convinced that the ideas are legitimately false or true, and that's when individuals can actually create awareness on the ground itself. In the debate today, there's two major questions that we have to answer. Is this theory, does the legitimization of this theory actually cause harm? We don't think so. We think in order for most information to be transferred to individuals on the ground, we have to allow it go its opposition.
Firstly, to deal with a little misrepresentation that we thought was coming from side opposition over here. They said that when we ban this theory, this will actually add fuel to the idea and make people think that it's already weak. Simple response: we're not banning it in public. We're just disallowing the scientists from actually just spreading it out in the first place. Therefore, if people were to take an active stance in banning this theory, then nobody else would know about us banning this theory. This is why people wouldn't view this theory as a weak theory in the first place, but because scientists actually come up with this theory and tell you that it's all humans' fault in the first place, people will look at it like it's still very professional and credible theory in the first place. But that's right. The first and major issue of today: will our model be effective in combating pollution? Because coming from this side of the House, they've been arguing that status quo is enough. Mr. Speaker, sir, we beg to differ. How? We told you, which is under their case, right, status quo. We concede to the fact that yes, environmental policies have been enacted and have been polished, but we still don't think that this is enough. But what happens if you don't disallow? You make the environmental problems much more severe. You exacerbate the problems under status quo. We just tell you that the check and balances are not enough. Seeing as how the world has come to a 70% rise in carbon emission in the first place, but we also think that now there's an increase in river and air pollution, even much more worse, where and even but also into China and Japan's industrialization policies, which don't even help the environment in the first place. They further empower these cars which still emit these
harmful gases to the air, but also to these factories, which still also emit this pollution towards the air. We don't think that the world has come to enough step of recognition of how important the environment is. We concede to the fact that the state has run these pro-environmentalist policies, but we still do not think it's enough. You see you see pollution still apparent within the environment. We still don't think that status quo is enough. Not yet. But how does our policy come into play, right? We tell human mentality. Now, under status quo, humans initially think that it's partially their fault. This is why it's still insufficient, because they can still think that they can still contribute towards pollution in this certain sense, because this problem of climate change is only partially their fault in the first place. This is why we beg to differ and tell you that it's wholly their fault. This changes the whole perspective of humans in the first place. Now, it adds more fuel to this claim, and this is how we tell you it can be effective. But also, an added benefit of our model is that it defeats corporation projects, because corporations are just money entities, and they'll just go for this anyway, even if it infringes between the law. We tell you then, because of this, they can simply use the excuse that climate change is not fully their fault in the first place. But now when we empower this policy, and this is how corporations can use it to mitigate the punishment given towards them. But now, since there's no more excuse apparent, we can fight this with this in the first place. Not yet, Deborah. But also, even if this is not effective to the extent that they tell us that it is, we still tell you that it will be much more better as a whole, even if it's not that effective. But also, we don't see any particularly harm with implementing our policy, as it just further just helps the awareness issue. Our model will be effective to a certain extent in combating the pollution. But second issue of today, is our model principally justified? Well, they talked about us not allowing choices because there's no objective harm. Well, first response, there is an objective harm here. The objective harm here is not climate change, but it's pollution. This is something real and still apparent. State can still ban and stop all these people from still pollution, because the pollution itself is a harm towards the environment, a harm to us all. But also, even if there's no harm, and then we just tell you there's nothing wrong with state doing it, because it just brings a benefit at the end of the day, and therefore there's nothing wrong here. This is how we tell you that there is an objective harm. Not yet. But also, they talk to us about states misprioritizing environment and economy, right? Well, let's be realistic here. We don't think that when environment policies are enacted, somebody would actually just neglect the idea of their economical policy of their government in the first place. They would just manage it much more better. But they talked about us disallowing choices, right? Well, first response, following the social contract theory, the state can take away some of your choices. The same way that the state forces you to wear a seatbelt when you're in your car, because it will cause harms to yourself. All the more reason as why pollution, which is a harm to us all the more reason as to why state can stop people from taking these choices. We empower the claim that climate change is because of pollution in the first place. We can deter this problem much more better. Mr. Speaker, sir, we tell you if it comes to a utilitarian benefit, which benefits the whole of society and environment itself, then it overcomes any sort of harm that we can take by disallowing choices. The worst case scenario of us is maybe yes, we are disallowing choices, maybe, but the worst case scenario harm of that is that it deteriorates the very aspect of environment in the first place. Worst case harm scenario. This is why our model is principally justified. But before I elaborate more,
pollution might be a harm objectively made by the state, but that how they can make pollution actually causing climate change objectively.
yeah, but then we tell you this is why but until it brings this benefit of further awareness, and it's a much different caliber of enforcement than status quo has enforced it much more better. This is why it's still justified. But also lastly, we tell you how our model will still push state to push further enact policies on pro-environmental interest basis. This is how it further enforces the policies under status quo. This is why this model is principally justified. But final issue of today, they wanted to talk about theories and ideas, right? Well, they question why didn't we just block out the market of ideas. We tell you because we block out scientists from telling people, and we block out all forms of ideologies from any professionals telling people. This is how it's so exclusive, because people are more surely to believe a credible professional scientist rather than somebody who just
spits it out in a conversation in a free flow of market ideas. But secondly, they tell us how it deters research. Nonsense. We tell you how we're not disallowing people from researching it, we're allowing them to do so, and therefore they can still fulfill their interest of researching in these particular interests, which they still want in the first place. It's still in the nature of science, where they can research every single theory and aspect that they want to. We're just allowing them that they cannot spread this idea, as it causes a huge harm towards society. This is why, at the end of the day, the benefits of discourse of ideas and how people would think much more, and intellectual discourse being apparent, is mutually exclusive under our case as it is to theirs. This is why, under the issue of theories and ideas, we tell you that this is also justified. We're not blocking any form of theory or idea. People can still research it. We're just banning them from putting it out to status quo. But at the end of the day, whatever the case, Mr. Speaker, whatever harms that we may be causing, the harms that happens if we don't implement this policy is much more worse. For a utilitarian benefit and for the environment, I beg to propose.
Yes, side opposition does. We do Earth to total destruction. But what we fought for, that they never really solve it. They only want to push the blame onto people, that a blame that they themselves agreed is not necessarily true, in the idea that we need to stop people from being complacent. Corporations already know that these things are wrong, right? And they still continue doing it. They're doing nothing to change their mindset. But we also told you, right, that the state can, especially when there's no objective harm. Tariq's idea was this, that it's that if you put poison in a river, the fish there will die, and the people that drink the water from that river will also die, right? But it's subjective that this river will somehow cause climate change in something that on, and was very unfortunate for them, honestly. But look, there's three questions we need to answer in this debate today. Firstly, is this necessary? Secondly, what is the state's role exactly? And thirdly, what are the repercussions of both of our... Is this notice that people were really complacent and we need to give them a push? Sure, we need them to give them a push, but they never told us why their push was in the right direction, right? Because theories were necessarily true. Because Emin's idea was that just because you ban one theory, it does not mean that this other theory suddenly becomes a fact, right? Like, they tried to tell us also that you can still do research into other theories that are published, but also, like, why would someone want to do research that would not be published to this kind of... So government has to concede that they are stopping people's research, they are stopping people from this kind of discourse, because it will go nowhere in their paradigm, right? But let's look at the idea, right, that corporations and generally people are so money-minded that they will always choose to pollute, right? We don't think so, because the tangible harms that we talked to you about, right, like if you have an oil spill, you kill all the fish. If you have smoke, there's haze, and people have to wear masks all the day. These are tangible harms that people see, right? We think that that's enough of an incentive for people to get better, right, in the things that they do to the environment. We think that considering there are already tangible harms to these kinds of pollution, that's a way that the state can already increase regulation, just as what happened recently in Utah, right? They just set tighter curbs on the industrial pollution, and it's decreased their pollution by 15%. Without having to tell people, no, it's only your fault that the pollution is going on. But it's better for them, right, to be able to allow people to rationalize in the public court of opinion so that it can be openly disproved or not. Because also, something that came out in Liza was this, right, that you don't entirely erase these theories from people's minds, because there will still be people who support the idea that, no, it can't just be my fault, right, I'm only one person, right, and these kinds of opinions still happen there. But without the idea that you need to disprove these theories, which the government does not allow anymore, right, you can't have this discourse
in these people, and that's something that's bad. Because like Eliza's opening line already talked to you about how there's a bunch of theories going around, that there's always a counter discourse, and that side government only sets a double standard when one kind of lie is allowed but the other is not, right? We told you these lies, if they are self-correcting, and therefore no harm comes from it, right? It only comes from when you don't allow people to rationalize their choices. Yes.
Okay, so now are you saying that states reducing can actually change your mindset? But actually, in our case, we believe that changing your mindset.
Sir, it doesn't necessarily mean changing mindsets, but if you make it illegal to, let's say, do something like pollute the river, it doesn't matter your mindset, right? You're not going to do it because you don't want to go to jail. Okay, that's the point, right? That's the state's role. But second idea, right? What is the state's role here? Because their idea was this, the social contract, right? They never gave it any analysis as to what it was. But I know what it is, right? Okay, it's about taking away a right when it objectively removes another. What was Tariq's response to that, right? He told us, yeah, it does remove another's right, kind of thing. But look, right, pollution is something that we can limit, right? But like Eliza POI just now, pollution has no link to climate change, right? So obviously we're not fighting about who changes these pollution best. It's about like who accurately points out the cause of this climate change, and we think that side opposition does that, right? But let's look at the idea, right? That the state needs to do this kind of thing because society will never claim that it is their fault. That society, the only thing that we can do is have the government make these things illegal. We're fine with that, right? If you can show us a definite harm, a definite link, as opposed to a theory as to how climate change came about, then we're fine with the state making these kinds of things illegal, right? The problem is that the state has never gone for a ban on something that is not objectively wrong, right? We can still have laws on things like oil spills and things like Kyoto Protocol because we know that these carbon emissions are bad for us, right, when we breathe it in. But like, let's look at what we talked to you about what the state's role is, because we need to allow for a right to expression, right? Because the government stance is like in their side would still be a theory, right? Meaning that it's not definite, it's something that no government would have ever allowed to happen in the first place, right? Like the response, however, was that there was too much worldwide harm, right? But we think that it's important, right, for a transfer the things be put into the court of public opinion, where it's self-correcting, right? If something is genuinely wrong, it will be proved wrong. If something is genuinely correct, it will be proved correct, right? But the problem that they never analyze is people who already know that they're wrong and they're still doing wrong things. How are they going to be curbed in their paradigm? No, thank you. Let's look at the third idea on the repercussions of these two paradigms, right? Because they told us that corporations were complacent and we needed to make them better, right? But like we said earlier on in the POI, a lot of these corporations already believe that they're wrong, right? We think that the thing that you can do about it is to find the definite harm and make that illegal. But you can't just tell them that certain actions that they do cause this climate change when it is still a theory, right? But what were the kinds of repercussions that we talked about and their responses? Eliza told you from the get-go that there was an excessive exaggeration that happened. Their response was that the state, right? But look, we think that it's because these environmentalists are so adamant in their beliefs, because they believe themselves that it is not exaggeration but simply the truth. This is why it happens even if the state does not mean for it to happen, because they cannot delineate because of the strength of their beliefs, right? What happens when you have this excessive exaggeration? There's no incentive for people to research more into other sides because they think, I'll never be able to publish it, nobody will ever believe me, or the state will clamp down on me in my household, right? You cannot disprove, therefore, because you don't have a discourse on like the validity of the stance of the government, because the government will be just like, you know, we are right, right? Because like the long-term harm is this, right? There's a potential that people will still continue doing things that harm the environment without doing so. There's a harm that even worse, if one day the government theory turns out to be wrong and the decisions that people went to jail for, the decisions that people were barred from doing, turn out to have been fine all along. We think that that's an even worse harm that happens in their paradigm, right? Banning does not mean that a theory is proven true or false. You cannot go with a side as shaky as side government. Thank you.
Three reasons why side government lost today's debate. First reason, there wasn't really a clear stance and it shifted throughout their whole bench. Firstly, the PM said that this issue was subjective, but throughout the whole bench, it said it apparently is humans' fault, and therefore, in order to correct the environmental problems, we have to correct the human attitudes towards the environment. So we didn't really know which stance they were standing on to begin with. And the whip himself had to come out and clarify his stance that, hey, now scientists are the only one who can't tell people, when the PM already said that we ban everyone from telling people. So we weren't really sure whether this side was really consistent or not. So a shifty stance resulted in a confusing case, resulted in many arguments which were why they lost today's debate. They weren't principally consistent, and I have a few analyses towards why they weren't principally consistent. Firstly, they said banning this theory will be okay because it's most likely to be untrue, it's most likely to encourage people to do the right thing. But then they said, even if it's partially humans' fault, we would exaggerate it and wholly blame it on humans. So the idea is this: they banned a lie, but they wanted to lie and exaggerate the harm to the people even more. So they wanted to lie and exaggerate the theory that it's humans' fault to people even more. We don't really see how their side was principally consistent, that if it's a lie, we should not propose it to people. But their side already agreed in the whip speech also that, hey, we exaggerated it to make sure people actually change their mindset and change their incentive. We don't see how that stance was really good. But secondly, Eliza also POI'd the whip and said, hey, but pollution is not objectively linked to climate change. The whip said, yeah, pollution is not objectively linked to climate change. But then if that's the case, they also insist that human choice had to be curbed to help the environment, even though there's no marginal benefit at the end of the day. So why curb human choice at the end of the day if there's no marginal benefit to the environment? They didn't really prove why it's true. They didn't prove why it's untrue. We don't see how they're principally consistent at the end of the day. And the whip, once again, he told you this thing: we allow scientists to research this idea that this theory could be true, but we'll just ban them from publishing it. What is the whole point of them researching it if they're not going to publish it at the end of the day? And that's a principal concession. If you allow individuals constantly research these things, and it's likely to be true at the end of the day, it means that all theories should exist in the marketplace. It means that all theories could potentially be true and should be developed further. Third reason why they lost today's debate is they never really attempted to fulfill that burden. They set out two burdens for themselves, and I'm quoting them verbatively. Number one, how they can actually change people's mindset on the ground, and number two, how they solve the climate problems, or could potentially solve the climate problems through banning this theory. Look, they said under the first argument that actually change people's mindset, that people will actually be deterred from believing in something else because the idea that they pollute is because they attach their self-belief to this idea that it's not their fault. Look, we already told you three responses. Banning this theory doesn't mean everyone would no longer believe in it. The theory would still... It doesn't mean people will believe in the converse theory. And I never tried to respond to this idea which I brought up, that people will not necessarily believe that a theory which you don't ban is necessarily true at the end of the day. But thirdly, if all companies, which they themselves agree, already pollute at the existence of the legal punishment and repercussions such as jail, fines, and trade quotas, why would they necessarily have an incentive to believe in a mere state stance at the end of the day? We don't see why it's effective at that circumstance. But second burden is on itself, how it solved the climate problems. And this was necessarily problematic at the end of today's debate. They never really told you what was the actual cause of today's problem because they necessarily could not find the correct stance on the problem. They said it could be potentially humans' fault, but we agree it's subjective. We don't see which way they could actually solve the climate problems at the end of the day. Our side solved the problem. This problem, we need the most amount of information to the public. We need the most amount of research among all these theories, which could effectively one day lead to us finding the truth. Because truth, we can only prove a certain theory is false when we agree that all research should be developed to prove that theory is false. They don't allow that research to exist because they're merely banning it means everyone should not research on this theory anymore, and that's harmful. At the end of the day, they conceded to this harm. That if this thing is banned at the end of the day, even if this theory could potentially be true, they will still won't publish it to the public. The environment will still be harmed at the end of the day. They didn't solve their burden.
When the debate we have the proposition reply.
Side opposition thinks that there's already another alternative to solve this problem with environment. Don't need to hide this information on whether or not this climate change is caused by. But the problem here is that the Kyoto Protocol, or even the Copenhagen Treaties, or even other policies that is imposed onto solving the problems with environmental destruction is because they want to solve climate change in the first place. Right now, if you allow people to get their hands onto the information that climate change is caused by environmental factors, then all of these efforts that the government has already made would be useless at the end of the day, because people would the man-made pollution that they've already done inside status quo, and therefore there's a complacency that we like to ban. But then the first issue, can we find the reason to the cause of climate change? Coming from side government, we do agree that climate change is very subjective. We cannot find the reason on what did cause climate change. But then if we prove to the people that this climate, if we prove to the people, not prove to the people, if we show to the people the analysis and also the data that shows that man-made pollution does relate to the problem of climate change, then therefore people will be more conscious of the actions that they do. But the problem with side opposition here is that they assume that more discussion will lead to more problems, or will actually lead to more a more better solution to actually solve this whole problem, right? We think this is absurd, because right now we think that the only way for us to solve this problem of environmental destruction is not to actually point out that it is an environmental factor in the first place. Because if you do point out that it is an environmental factor in the first place, then we think that there's going to the development of the world into actually achieving to create a much more global society that does care for the environment, right? Because they think that more discussion would then lead more chances to actually find the causes of climate change in the first place. But this is very harmful, because if you actually say that climate change is related to environmental factors, then what happens to the people who listen and look at the analysis and data in the first place? The complacency is too huge compared to the environmental destruction that we see in today's status quo, where air pollution has already increased too much. We also see that corporations have already been complicit in actually preventing oil spills inside the sea, and this, because of this destruction, are very irreversible in the first place, right? We like to prevent these corporations by even giving a huge incentive for them to not become complicit in these situations, but also imposing the fear of being guilt of having liability over the fault of climate change in the first place. But then they say that the theory would still exist at the end of the day, meaning to say that people would still not care about it, right? First of all, you're not actually sticking to government stance, in which we say that opposition should not debate on the stance that we would call it a bluff. But then even though you say that the theory will still exist, well, that's the reason why we ban it, right? To actually show the analysis and data, to actually convince people that this climate change is caused by people. And because only this information does exist inside society, that society would be convinced with it. And the theory that climate change is caused by environmental factors wouldn't actually be existing in the first place, right? But then we think there's a contradiction coming from Deborah over there, because right now they said that if there's a harm in climate change, then it is okay for us to actually impose this policy. We think that it is okay for us then to impose our proposal here, because right now this climate change is a harm in the first place, and because of this we must allow the people to actually have that kind of incentive to solve the problem with climate change. But even if this climate change is not caused by human factors, at least we're still solving another problem here, in which we're solving the problem of people becoming complicit in solving environmental destruction and also pollution, which still gives a benefit at the end of the day. We think that our efforts isn't going to be useless. It's going to be very hugely contributive to the world, and in the end of the day, the world will become much more to live in a safe environment.